All right. It's good to see you. 40 years. Chris and I, we were 21. We were newlyweds. This was us 40 years ago. That's Ada Bible Church. That was before my last year in college. And so Ada Bible Church was a church plant. The church planter moved on, and they asked us, would you fill in until we find a real pastor? Finally, Aaron is here. They got one, finally. It's the longest meeting search committee in the history of the world. So 40, so this is Chris and I now. So we still like each other most days. I started dating her. I thought she was cute. I still think she's cute. So 40 years. So when you've like been in a position for 40 years, senior pastor, and then you slide out of that position and take a secondary role in a church, it requires certain ceremony, certain moments of celebration. And one of those moments was here at our East Paris campus, out in the atrium, the staff was invited to gather for dessert one day to... All right, there we go. I get the hint. Start over? Start over. 40 years. 40 years. All right. Those of you in Wisconsin, so sorry, man. So sorry for that. 40 years, and so it requires certain ceremony, right? Certain ceremony. And so one of those moments was out in our atrium. Staff was invited to gather for dessert, celebrating our 4 decades in ministry at Ada. Chris was with me, and that's what we do here in the Midwest. 40 decades of ministry. Let's eat cake. And so we're just kind of gathered in a semicircle, and I gave a speech. It wasn't a speech I planned on giving, and it wasn't a speech that I prepared. But it was like a 75-second impromptu speech. And I didn't write it down afterwards, but the speech went something like this. This is how the speech went. The goal isn't to make it 40 years in ministry, either in one ministry or any sequence of ministries. That's not the goal. The goal is to make it 40 years and still love Jesus. The goal is to make it 40 years and not resent people. The goal is to make it 40 years and not resent your church or your organization. Man, the goal is to make it 40 years and still kind of be intact as a family. Now, if you can do that, that's something worth having. That was a speech. It was short, but I think it was important. It's important especially because of the bumps and bruises that we acquire in ministry. The disappointments, the people who come and the people who go. The possibility that someday someone might say something unkind or even untrue about you. That day when your greatest fan becomes your greatest critic. The gravitational pull is to begin to serve out of a wounded heart, to serve out of a resentful heart, to serve out of a numb heart, or even to serve out of a heart that is deadened, increasingly deadened. The purpose of this ReCourage conference is to ask the question again and again, how is it possible to continue to serve people around us in a church setting, in a nonprofit, in the business world, and really be able to be fully alive to God and be able to be fully alive to people amid the bumps and bruises of ministry when you get dinged up a little bit. And so there are some phenomenal conferences that deal with leadership strategy, how to set goals, how to set vision, how to build a team. So many groups do that. Well, this isn't that. This is just how can you have a good heart day after day, week after week, and year after stinking year. So I believe the most critical component, hands down, the most critical component for a believer is this right here, and I just use the words gospel-centered ministry. Gospel-centered ministry. That's kind of the theme of what I want to talk about today. Definition of terms, so we're all like talking about the same thing. The word gospel that's used in the Bible, word gospel means good news. Literally, it's two Greek words kind of sandwiched together, and it means good news. And often it was used in secular culture, not a Bible word, but like when an announcement would be made of something that has happened in the empire. The Emperor Augustus has just given birth to a son. There is an heir to the throne. The Romans have just defeated such and such. And so a courier would come into your town, and he would say, gospel, good news, but good news is about something that has happened, and this is critical. Gospel isn't about what you do. It's not do more, try harder. It's fundamentally about something that has been done. And to reduce this to its simplest form, I would just say this. What gospel means is someone took my place. Okay, can you say that here and other locations as well? Can you say, ready? Someone took my place. Now say it again, but emphasize the word my. Say, someone took my place. Someone took my place. That's at the heart of the gospel. So when we talk about the cross of Jesus, there's just a whole lot of stuff that happened here. One thing that happened at this gospel moment, and this someone took my place thing, is it's like my grime got carried by Jesus and his goodness gets transferred to me. It's like he wears my grime, I wear his goodness. That's good news of the gospel. The gospel is not primarily about trying to find God. This is the God who came down to find you. It's not primarily about do more, try harder. It is something you cannot earn and something you do not deserve. This grace can only be received. That's the gospel. At the heart of the gospel is the understanding that God doesn't love you because you've been good. He loves you because he's good. And some of you right now are just kind of going, okay, can we move on? Can get things moving, move on. Now, because see, look, it is a leadership conference held at a church, and most of the people here probably are either connected to a church or work for some organization that's faith-based, or maybe even an employee, staff person at a church. Jeff, most of the people in the room understand the gospel, so that's our starting point, but then we move on from the gospel. The gospel is the starting point, but then we move on to a life of Christian obedience, a life of Christian learning, a life of ministry, maybe a life of organizational leadership, perhaps church leadership. And we see the gospel as a starting point that you move on from. And when I talk about gospel-centered ministry, what I'm really talking about is a life that is anchored and centered in the gospel. And it's not something you move on from. It's something you have to keep moving deeper and deeper into. That the gospel, this he forgives me, is not the starting point. It's the starting point, it's the middle point, it's the end point, it's all the points between. It is the point. And not to lose that as I move through ministry. What I'm trying to say is that this gospel message is not something you move on from. It's something that you go deeper and deeper into. And the more deeply you go into the gospel story, that this is the God who came to find you. He forgives you. He sacrificed himself for you. I'm telling you, if you go back to that day after day after day, it unleashes something. It empowers something. It frees you to do things in the service of other people that you simply will not have the capacity to do if you see the gospel as a starting point and you leave it behind and move on from it to any number of other things. And so I've organized some of my thoughts today around 3 types of freedom that come with going deeper and deeper into the gospel. And the first area is just what I'm calling freedom to love. Going deeper in the gospel, having a gospel-centered life, it really does free you to love people well. The Apostle Paul wrote to believers around the city of Ephesus, major metropolitan area in the first century. And in chapter 5 of Ephesians, he writes these words. He says, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ what? Loved us, and what? And gave himself for us. He's, listen, imitate your Creator. Walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved you and gave himself for you. And there's just 2 words here. It's just the 2 words, love gives. Love gives. I mean, the little kid comes to a Sunday school class. One of the first verses a kid can learn in a children's ministry is often John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave, because love gives. Husbands, in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul threw this down to husbands where he says, husbands, man, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, because love gives. Love gives. In Galatians, this is where the Apostle Paul confessed, the life I live by faith in the Son of God who two things, who loved me and gave himself for me. Love is less of an emotion and more of a life of sacrificial giving. Love gives. We give of our time. We give of our focus. And we give of our attention to the people that we serve, because love gives. You know, I'm all about this. What I have resented over 40 years of ministry is that I seem to be required to love at times that I find wildly inconvenient and that are not entirely comfortable. I would be able to love people so much better if only it were more comfortable and convenient. And yet when I am gospel-centered and I go back to the cross, of all the words I would use to describe the cross, comfortable and convenient are not two of them. But understand, this is not just, okay, believers, love, it's the second greatest commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love, there it is. No. We're given the motivation and the empowering. Back to that verse, it said, follow God's example as, and the three words there, what are they? As what? As what? As? First and foremost, you need to see your fundamental identity as a daughter of the Creator, and you are deeply cherished and deeply loved. First and foremost, you need to see yourself as God's treasured son. This is what we mean by gospel-centered. Three expressions here. I need to see myself as infinitely loved, infinitely treasured, and infinitely secure. Infinitely loved, infinitely treasured, and infinitely secure. If I am serving and attempting to love out of wounds of the past, out of a history of rejection, after parents that never gave me what I thought I needed, if I'm loving as a way of trying to prove my value and deeply resentful at anyone that doesn't value me and see me as worthwhile, if I'm serving out of the insecurity of the past instead of the security of the present, we're talking entirely different motivation, entirely different empowering. Remembering that we're God's treasured sons, his cherished daughters, it frees us to love very difficult and complicated people at inconvenient and uncomfortable times. I've mentioned this before. I journal, and the way I usually sign off my journal at the end of the day is I usually write a statement that says, this is Jeff, your beloved son, or this is Jeff, the son you love. Or in really complicated days, this is Jeffrey Wayne Manion, the child you love. I don't write that to remind God. I write that to remind me. A couple weeks back, I made this entry. When I recall that I am infinitely loved, when I recall that I am infinitely loved, it makes me more capable of extending love to difficult people. When I recall that I am infinitely loved, it makes me more capable of absorbing criticism without retaliation. When I recall that I am loved, it makes me more capable of giving generously of my time and of my treasure. When I remember that I am infinitely loved, it allows me to more aggressively forgive slights and annoyances. It's gospel-centered. There's a picture of a guy here that some of you will know, some of you won't. Tim Keller passed away last May of pancreatic cancer. He's a pastor in New York City, Redeemer Presbyterian Church. He's written a bunch of stuff. There's a story I read from Tim some time ago where he talked about being at Redeemer Presbyterian, and week after week you'd see some woman sitting like near the back of the room, and like before the service would end, she'd take off and go out. This was clearly a person that did not want to get met. And one day he trapped her. Somehow he got to her before she hit the door, and he just kind of goes, hi. And she like, listen, I'm intrigued by what's happening here, but you just need to know I don't believe all this stuff yet. And he says, well, what are you doing here? How did you find this? And she told a story about what had happened at the TV network where she serves. She was newer, had an important job at a television network, and she made a mistake. The kind of mistake that is career ending. She should have been canned. She should have been fired. And her boss at the TV network went into the decision makers and said, listen, rather than blaming her, I really need you to blame me. I didn't train her right. I didn't prepare her right. If someone should be punished here, punish me, not take it out her. And she kept her job. But later, she goes into her boss's office and it's kind of like, okay, what was that all about? He said, yeah, don't worry about it, never mind. She says, no, I need to know because I have a lifetime of people above you taking credit for stuff you do, but blame always flows downward. Why did you do? No, don't worry about it. She says, no, I need to know. And finally he goes, okay, but remember, you asked for it. What he said to her was this: you need to understand something. I'm a Christian. My entire life is based on someone who took the blame for me. And I try to revolve my entire life around that. Now, there's a word for that. It's called love. It's placing your own interests second and someone else's interests first. But that love was gospel-centered, gospel-grounded, gospel-anchored, gospel-focused. It wasn't just a starting point, okay, now on with business, now on with career, now on, with the network. It's like the gospel traveled with him into every arena of life. What I'm trying to say here, firstly, is that going deeper into the gospel, someone came for me, someone died for me, someone loved me, someone gave up himself for me. I'm telling you, it can free you, unleash you, and empower you to love very difficult people at very challenging times. The gospel can free you to love. The second category here is just the gospel can free you to forgive. The gospel might free you to forgive that person. Listen, it's just, you're gonna get hurt. There's just no way to love and serve people for any length of time without getting a little dinged up. You're gonna get hurt. Someone's gonna say something stupid. Someone's gonna say something harmful to you or about you. The person you've invested in will walk. Your greatest cheerleader will become your harshest vocal critic. You're gonna get hurt. And so this is what we do. We then attempt to become specialists at not getting hurt. And I would just like to suggest, instead of trying to become a specialist at not getting hurt, what people in long-distance marathon ministry really need is to become specialists in healing. And forgiveness is just hyper-critical to that healing process. So let's go back to, what Paul was writing in Ephesians, and you find this in chapter 4, verse 32. My mother made me memorize this in the King James Version of the Bible when in a major altercation with my sister, who was wrong. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as in Christ God, what? Forgave you. Or be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as in Christ God forgave you. Forgiveness. What is it? I mean, how do you even know when you're doing it? How do you know when you're in the process of doing it? How do you know when it's done? Forgiveness. Jesus, his disciples said, would you teach us to pray? And Jesus says, okay, when you pray something like this. What comes out of this is the Lord's Prayer. And in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus would say, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Okay, in that forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. But that word debtor was often used as a monetary term, like someone owes you money. Okay, forgive us what we owe as we forgive others who owe us. So there's something reflexively that comes out of our system when someone wounds us, harms us, makes us look foolish, and this statement comes out of our system really fast. You owe me because you've robbed me. You've robbed me of my serenity. You've robbed me of my honor. You've robbed me of my reputation. You've robbed me of sleep. You, help me here. You owe me. When Jesus says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, it means somehow to come to a point where I'm able to say this second statement here, I'm not going to make her pay. Just for fun, can we read that one together? I'm not going to make her pay. any conversation about forgiveness, immediately there's objections to surface. Like, dude, not everyone should be forgiven. And clarifying statement here, there's a difference between forgiveness and trust, because forgiveness is given. My friends, trust has to be earned. And so a woman, she's engaged. She finds out that her fiance has had some extracurricular activity with one of her friends. Question, should she forgive him? Absolutely. That doesn't mean she keeps the wedding date. Forgiveness doesn't mean restoration of position. If someone embezzles from a company and it's found out, forgive me, I do forgive you, you can't hold that job anymore at that company. So there's a difference between forgiveness and trust. But forgiveness is in one way or another to come to a point to say, you don't owe me anymore. Forgiveness is absolutely critical for long-term relationships, because what we want is relationships that don't break. And what we get are relationships that get fractured and need to be repaired. Relationships break. Every once in a while, I'll see a church and they'll have, like, in their brochure or whatever, they'll have, we're a safe place. And I go, you probably are, unless there's people. If there's people, there's going to be fractures over time. And so, now there's all kinds of good motivations to forgive people. I could say forgiveness is critical to your emotional health long term. That's true. That's not the motivation given in Ephesians 4. I could say forgiveness will prevent you from becoming a bitter old person. That may be true. That's not the motivation given in Ephesians chapter 4. I could say your unwillingness to deal with the past will prevent you from moving into an effective future. That is true. That is not the motivation that is given in Ephesians 4. The motivation in Ephesians 4, if we can go back, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as what? Just as Christ forgave you. What this means is every once in a while you need to take a deep dive into your own depravity. So I want you to say something with me, even if you don't totally believe it yet. I want you to say, I was really messed up. Ready? I was really messed up. The motivation, why in the world should I forgive that dirtbag? Because Jesus forgave me when I was a dirtbag. But you have to get a grasp of this dirtbagness. In order for this to be a motivator, in order for this to really kick in. Because after a while, we use this run-on sentence, Jesus died for my sins. See if it's like one long word, Jesus died for my sins. And sometimes you just want to go, really, which ones? All of them. Well, such as? Well, I'm sure there were times I wasn't kind. Oh, really, to who? And what impact did that leave on them? Because there's this intensity. So listen, I just wasn't that bad. You really were. Here's the deal. In order to fully embrace forgiveness, this is how we want to treat my crimes of the heart, these contrasts of the next two statements here. I want to see my sins as few, minor, and easily excused. Not that bad, not that often. And man, if you knew what they did, if you knew the upbringing I had, few, minor, and easily excused. And we need sometimes just to remember that there were many severe and just no excuses. Many, severe, and no excuses. So I am in a 100-day break from Ada Bible Church. This right here is the sole speaking commitment I have during this sabbatical in order to allow Pastor Aaron Buer to have his first 100 days as senior pastor with minimal backseat driving. And so I've had the privilege, I've been staying away from Ada Bible Church, and I've been visiting other churches. I visited a Wesleyan church here in Grand Rapids, a newer church, where I swear I was the oldest person in the room. And in Florida, Naples, I attended a Presbyterian church where I swear I was the youngest person in the room. And I attended an Anglican church, and this was a prayer that they prayed together collectively as a congregation the morning I was there. I want you to read this prayer out loud with me. Ready? Almighty God, we acknowledge and confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed. We have not loved you with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We have not loved our neighbor as ourselves. Deepen within us our sorrow for the wrong we have done and the good we have left undone. Amen. I need to read that every single day. God, I confess to you, you don't have my whole heart. I haven't even begun to love others like I love me. Increase in me a sorrow for the stuff I do and the stuff I don't do that I could have done. Why, Jeff, come on, this is so, listen, to live as a forgiver. I just think it helps every once in a while to remember what was forgiven. You don't stay in that dark space, but you need to visit that dark space every once in a while just to go, I was forgiven so much. And I'm telling you, when the forgiveness that happens through the cross, when it isn't something you leave behind, when it's not something you move on from, when it's not simply the starting point and now you get on with life, but when you live a gospel-centered, gospel-focused, gospel-anchored life and you go back again and again and again to what he did for you, you just might find yourself increasingly freed to cut some people some flack who wounded you and to finally let them go. There's a song that we sometimes sing. It's How Deep the Father's Love for Us. You know that one? How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he would give his chosen one to make a wretch his treasure. And he made me his treasure. My crime transferred to Jesus. Jesus' goodness transferred to me. Going back into the gospel deeper and deeper and deeper and more often, it can free you to love, it can free you to forgive. And just the last deal here is it can free you from ministry idols. It can free you from ministry idols. What I mean by idol here is a substitute God, you know. We sing to God be the glory. To Jeff be the glory. You know, what is it that I use as a God replacement? So let me introduce you to one. I'm sure it's one of your favorite characters. It's this guy right here, Blaise Pascal. Jeff, I know of Blaise Pascal, but could you please refresh my memory? Okay. Just as a refresher course, Blaise Pascal was a mathematician and philosopher, a physicist in the 1600s. He was a child prodigy. And by child prodigy, I mean this. He wrote a textbook on geometry when he was in high school. Which means that if we would gone to high school together, we would not have hung out. Okay. Now, while you may not be familiar with the name, you will be familiar with a condensed version of something he wrote in his book of reflections. It's called Pensées. So in Pensées, you find these words. There is a God-shaped vacuum. Oh, he was the one that said that. All right. There's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator made known through Jesus Christ. And from that's been condensed to poster size. There's a space in the heart that only God can fill. You heard that one? That's a reduction of Pensées' term. And we think, oh, that's awesome. There's this little space in my heart that only God can fill. My friends, this is not a little space in my heart. It's a cavern. Think not little space in my heart. Think Grand Canyon. That is the emptiness that is me, that I try to fill with stuff. And two words, just the two words, never enough. If money becomes my God, I will never have enough stuff. The bank account will never be enough to fill the empty void that is me. The void is so infinite, I need an infinite being to fill the infinite space. Trust in beauty to feel like you're significant and secure, and you will feel unattractive and be deeply disrupted by every wrinkle. It is an unreliable God. Trust success and you will never feel successful enough. Trust in your intellect. You will feel foolish and like a fraud, like people are going to discover you. And the deal is that in ministry, we use statements like, I just want to lead a dynamic, effective ministry that honors God, and that is true, but what we also want is to lead a ministry, and it makes us feel important. I'm telling you, if your God becomes feeling important, you will never feel important enough. If you begin to worship ministry success, you will never feel successful enough. If you are an affirmation junkie and you just need the approval of others, no affirmation will be enough. And what ends up happening over time is often we replace ministry for God or ministry success. Never successful enough, never big enough to fill that empty space. Never enough followers, never enough likes to fill the empty space. That is me. Our gracious God came to do that. Some years back, I was hanging out with a pastor older than I was. He had, later in his 60s, he had handed off the baton of leadership in his church. And he pastored, it was the largest church in Ohio at the time. I'm sitting with him at a Panera Bread here in Grand Rapids. I'm going like, what are you feeling in letting go of the ministry that he built and that he grew and that he led? And he looked at me and very succinctly and matter-of-factly, he said, I'm not important anymore. I'm not important anymore. That is, I used to lead meetings. I used to set strategy. I used to be in charge of this organization. And he just looked at me and said, I'm not important anymore. I just go, wow, what would that feel like to carry something for that long and then hand off that responsibility? What would that be like? I'm about to find out. While I was on the first part of my break, there was a church tragedy that occurred at Cascade campus, and Pastor Aaron Buer, sent an email to Cascade attenders to let them know. I received the email, my wife received that email, and the sign-off at the end of the email was this: Aaron Buer, senior pastor. And I just went, oh, that was the first time I'd seen it in writing, the first time yeah, it's true. And that was just one of those moments where I go, it never was my church, but now it really isn't. Many of our conference rooms have glass walls. In April, when I return in a secondary role at Ada, there will be moments where I will be walking down the hallway and look into executive meetings that I used to lead. And I am literally on the outside looking in. Does remembering that I am infinitely loved, infinitely treasured, and infinitely secure, do you think perhaps that will need to come into play somewhere along the line? Had a wonderful opportunity last summer. My house had some international pastors come in. Most of the time we spent outside around the picnic table in back. There was a guy from Poland, a guy from Finland, two guys from Czech Republic, one from Cambodia. It was just a preaching workshop to encourage them on their preaching. And so this is where I will be spending a lot of my future as I ask the question, what are my 60s supposed to be about? Pastors need to be pastored, and teachers need to be trained and encouraged, and that size of venue really, really is attractive to me. Will you agree with me, though, that it's kind of low profile? 12 years ago, I spoke to the largest gathering that, to this time in my life, I've ever communicated to. It happened to be in this room. There were 7,000 people that day, but then it was simulcast to different parts of the United States and then translated into other languages and watched by leadership groups around the world. And so I forget, but it was like 60 or 70,000 people watched that. So it's like a dozen years ago. If someone had stopped me at the door on the way out, and they were insightful and godly and wise, and if my back was to the 7,000 person room and they said, just come here for a minute, I have a word from God for you. I just see something in you and your ministry and your potential. I envision a day that if you stay faithful and keep your heart right and continue to be alive to people and alive to God, Jeff, I'm telling you, there will come a day where you will be able to sit in the backyard with 7 people. Now, I believe this is significant, and I believe this is impactful. but just agree with me that it's just a little lower profile. And it drives me in this season and approaching this season just to ask the question, what do I really need? And am I free? Am I free not to be in charge? Am I free to gather with 7 and not 7,000? Am I free to look less important? And those of you going, Jeff, man, you're 61, I'm 31. No, listen, this is for you. Because some of you will reach a point of exhaustion where your family's getting nothing. On the job description, it said, we need a high-capacity leader. And what they meant by that was, we will run you into the ground. High capacity, we just need you to do these 17 things. And there would come a point where you say, I just have to pull the plug. I just can't work these hours and have this fractured life and still connect with my wife and this 4-year-old and this 2-year-old. And you might find yourself taking something that pays less, and you get less attention and you get less recognition, and God frees you. But I'm telling you, if you know that you're infinitely treasured, infinitely loved, and infinitely secure, it sure makes things a whole lot easier if you're gospel-focused and not ego-focused. You walk into the office, you thought you were going to get a raise. And they go, we're sorry, we need to cut back. And we need to cut back several staff, and you're one of them. And finally, you find yourself going to outings. Hey, what do you do? No, I'm consulting. I'm kind of between right now. Can you see yourself as someone who's infinitely loved, infinitely treasured, and infinitely secure, and yet disappointed? What's it like to feel genuine disappointment, but that doesn't have to wreck me? Because the idea is, if I have nothing and I have Jesus, I got everything. Here and hereafter. If the church that you were leading was growing like crazy and it stops growing. If you have to close an organization that you helped start, and everything was banned on this, I have to look successful, I have to look important. What's it like to embrace disappointment in people and in life and still have this anchor, still have this center where I am centered? Is God's treasured son, infinitely treasured, loved, and secure. I'm telling you, I think for people in Christian ministry, going back to the cross again and again and again and again and again is one of the most critical things we do if we want to love well, if we want to forgive well, and if we want to resist the seduction of idols in ministry. This is why, in like the last part of Ephesians chapter 3, first chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, it's like there's no commands. Like the Apostle Paul just says, remember who you are, remember who you are, remember who you are. And then in chapters 4, 5, and 6, you get into Christian obedience stuff. It's kind of like, remember who you are before you even try to obey and respond. But at the end of chapter 3, the Apostle Paul throws down this prayer. He lets them know what he's praying for them. And this is the prayer he throws down over those people. He says, I pray that you, being rooted and established, being rooted in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people. And then he says this, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge. Do you know how loved you are? As we close, I pray you would in some way begin to fathom how high, and how deep, and how long, and how far is God's love for you. Because when we get anchored in that and centered in that, it frees us Day by day, it can free us to love difficult people. Day by day, it can free us to forgive people who harm us through something they say. Day after day, it can help us recenter and not drift away by our ministry idols. It's gospel-centered, gospel-anchored. May you know, may you come to know how high and deep and broad and far is God's love for you. Amen.